So, what were your general impressions of Ranciere? Anybody want to share?
I had a really hard time understanding him this week, or the readings this week were really tough for me. The first and last made no sense. The middle two, I was like, okay, I sort of maybe. So yeah, this week was a struggle for me.
Thank you for being honest.
I agree with that. I struggled so hard.
I agree.
Okay. Anybody else? We all seem to agree this was hard. Okay. I kind of suspected it as I was looking over the reading last night. I was thinking, oh boy, this is going to be a son of a bitch, this one. I lied to you last week. I told you last week that French philosophers in general are a handful and that Ranciere is an exception. And I lied because he's not an exception. He's a handful. I typically teach a different book of his called Hatred of Democracy, which actually is a much simpler read. But I've chosen a different book for this class because he deals with aesthetics. I personally think he's fabulous. And so it's my job to try and make, hopefully I can help you appreciate him today. I think he's really, really interesting and really, really good. Of course, I've told you this, my specialty is political philosophy. So as a political philosopher, I get really enthused by this. So the aesthetic side, we'll have to see how this goes. But I think he raises some really interesting points. And I think at the end of the day, his thesis for art is pretty straightforward, okay? It's pretty straightforward. So I hope I can get you to that point. Does anybody have any general questions before we dive in? He has a pretty unique way of writing as well. And I think a little similar to Heidegger, when we break through his lexicon, I think you will get to understand him better. He is living. This guy is alive and healthy, as far as I've heard. He lives in France. I don't believe he teaches in the States. A lot of French intellectuals come to the States and teach here, and I have not heard that he teaches here. I don't really know much of anything about him as a person, even though I've taught him for a couple of years now. I think probably the best way to tackle Ranciere is to just go through, well, chapter 1, he lays out these theses, 10 theses on politics. I think it's best if we just go through these. This is the foundation for him, and hopefully this will help us understand. He slowly wades deeper and deeper into aesthetics through these readings I've given you. And then by the last one, it's full-blown aesthetics at that point. But, let's start by pulling apart his thesis. So I'm going to look at the first one here. This is on page 27 in the reading that I've copied for you. He says, politics is not the exercise of power. Politics ought to be defined in its own terms as a specific mode of action that is enacted by a specific subject, and that has its own proper rationality, blah, blah, blah. What do you think he means to say here? What does he mean that politics is not the exercise of power?
Wouldn't this kind of go back to the reading response, which says that politics is it is a dissensus, it is a fabricated structure that is used to create a consensus within a society almost. It breeds new ideas.
Okay. Well, you've raced far ahead with some of those things. So let's slow down there a little bit. And your answer implies the solution. Your comments imply the answer here, but let's be very deliberate and specific. What does it mean to say that politics is not the exercise of power? And if it is not the exercise of power, what is it?
I mean, he kind of says it's like an act, like it's an action.
By
Like
whom?
I think it's by the groups that are like unrecognized or have no voice.
Who exercises power? What does that suggest? What does that make you think of? Exercising power.
I mean, the people, I guess, who are already in control or have,
Right. Those who would already be in control, they exercise power, right? And that is not politics. Politics is something very different. He quotes Aristotle, very famous statement from Aristotle's Politics, where he says, a citizen is he who partakes in the fact of ruling and of being ruled. That's what he means by action. Politics is not an exercise of power, it's a matter of action. And who acts? Citizens. And what do citizens do? They rule and are ruled. This is politics. The other thing I talked about, he's going to call that later the police state. Because there's no deliberation going on, right? The king says, you do. The king exercises power, you obey. But that's not politics. Politics is when there's deliberation among citizens. And when you have that deliberation, that suggests that citizens are free and equal. And this is the inherent, we're really talking about democracy here, right? And democracy, he's going to go on and say, has some inherent contradiction. And the inherent contradiction of democracy is that citizens rule and are ruled at the same time. Okay. He pushes back on the idea that there are intrinsic properties to a political subject, right? Rather, politics consists entirely, this is a quote on page 29, politics consists entirely in a relationship between two contradictory terms that define a subject, ruling and being ruled. Okay. This leads to the second thesis on page 29. What is specific to politics? The existence of a subject defined by its participation contraries. Politics is a paradoxical form of action. I've actually already explained that. Politics is a paradoxical form of action. What's more, he says politics emerges when we break with the logic of arche. This is where I need to explain some things. The logic of arche. Arche is a Greek term. Politics emerges when we break with the logic of arche. This is on page 30. At this point, he gets into discussion of Plato. Do you guys know why he brings up Plato? What point does he wish? What important point does he think Plato makes?
Plato breaks down like the different ways, like you could be in, like the order could be arranged in terms of a society.
Good. Yeah,
Like 6 reasons.
I forgot to define arche. Arche means the qualification to rule, right? Plato is famously critical of democracy. In the Republic, the democracy is the very bottom form of government before anarchy. It goes You have at the top, you have dictatorship of the philosopher, kings. Then you have a military state. Then you have oligarchy. And then you have democracy, and then tyranny and anarchy, which are one and the same. So he does not have a high respect for democracy. Right. So he cites Plato here when he takes up this issue of what are the qualifications to rule. And Plato reveals something surprising among the various qualifications to rule. He isolates one. Which one does he think is so important?
He says the ones who know more than the ones who don't.
Well, that's what Plato favors.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. I guess I misunderstood the question.
Okay.
You're saying which one does?
Does Ranciere, yeah.
Oh, I see. Okay. He says it's the one like the drawing of lots, or
Yes.
the chosen ones.
31. So Plato's Republic is going to be ruled by experts. That's Plato's vision, right? He thinks democracy is the pits because democracy, demos, has a bad connotation in ancient Greek. The demos in Greek means the rabble, and the rabble is like the lowest common denominator for I think we have some non-native English speakers here. The rabble is like the rowdy, uneducated masses. Just imagine they would rule. What the hell, right? Plato thinks that's ridiculous. You can't have that. Plato.
Question.
Yeah.
So if like democracy is demos, the rabble, then wouldn't America not technically be a democracy because the Senate and the Electoral College were set up specifically to dissuade the public from making opinions of their own because they thought that everybody else was stupid, and so like they needed a keeper of the public to make the choices.
Yes. Yes. Yes, that's accurate. And that's actually exactly what Ranciere thinks. But as usual, Jay, you're ahead of yourself. Slow down, drink your beverage, sit back. Let's get there.
It's coffee. That makes sense.
We're working on it. Let me just make this point again. Plato is an elitist. He is not in favor of democracy, never has been, because these are the uneducated, impassioned masses that would rule. Throughout history, we see people who's come down on that side. As Jay pointed out, the founding fathers, if you ever read the Federalist Papers, you will realize they were not too cool with the people voting. They said, I think it was Hamilton was like, we need a Senate and like that'll filter shit through. And in the 21st, today in the 20th and 21st century, Ranciere has been writing very passionately about contemporary critics of democracy. In fact, he cites a few. He notes that there is a lot of aversion to democracy, or as he calls it, like a fatigue with democracy. People are tired and people are worried about the uneducated masses, the mouth breathers, as we say in English, right? The numbskulls, the Trump voters, as some elite East Coasters like to think, okay? Plato goes through the various qualifications of what it takes to rule in his book called The Laws. And on page 30 and 31, Ranciere goes through these. What are the qualifications to rule? Among the many, being educated, being naturally intelligent, coming from, from wealth and privilege, there is a variety of them. And then among the various qualifications to rule, Plato says there's one strange one. It is having no qualifications at all. Just drawing lots by chance. This is the middle of page 31. However, Plato lists a seventh possible qualification for determining who's able to exercise the arche. He calls it the choice of God, or otherwise the drawing of lots. He does not expand upon this, but clearly the choice of regime, ironically be said of God, also refers to a regime that only a God could save, democracy. That's democracy. So democracy is characterized by the drawing of lots or the complete absence of any entitlement to govern. It is a state of exception in which no opposition can function, in which there's no principle for the dividing up of rules. So another way of putting it is that Plato objects to democracy because it is the rule by people who have no qualification to rule.
What was the Republic then? Because I do know something about the Republic was that they had a set tenure and then I think there was like a rotation system.
He doesn't get into details about he calls them the philosopher kings. He doesn't get into details about their tenure. He just says they should run the show. He's very difficult to pin down about that. I'm not going to take us on the sides. I'm not going to get us too sidetracked on that, but so democracy is characterized by the complete absence of entitlement to govern. This is what you need to understand. Plato sees this as a mark against democracy. Ranciere thinks it is its saving grace. This may sound strange to our ears. Liberals, such as us in the mica bubble, like to think, well, you need to have environmental experts run the EPA, and you have to have President Biden has to have qualifications. The whole Ranciere's kind of radical claim is democracy. What makes democracy is not that it comes to be, run on autopilot by experts. Because then how do the citizens react or respond? When it's run by experts, how do the citizens respond politically?
I guess there's like an implied like the citizens are then like lower in like intellectual power, and so it's harder for them to like push their views and their like issues.
How about this, Blythe? Do they feel inclined?
I guess it would be harder for them to question, although America has proved that people will go against experts.
Well, there's a couple of things here. The problem he points out is that when you're ruled by experts, you have no more political participation declines. As he would put it, you don't have politics. We go back to the first thesis. Politics is not the exercise of power. When experts run the show, that is effectively an exercise of power. And the people feel less inclined to get involved, right? Think about in America, we have what, 50% take part in elections in a good year? People don't feel the need to take part anymore. Well, that's not politics in his view. Yeah, so this goes to the next point about 31. The fourth thesis, democracy is not a political regime. This is weird. Democracy is not a political regime. What he means is that democracy is not just or not simply one option for government, right? Rather, it is the very institution of politics itself. That's his quote. Democracy is the institution of politics itself, which is to say that politics begins in earnest when there's no longer any recognized entitlement to govern or to be governed. I'm going to say that again, and then I'm going to explain myself. Politics begins in earnest when there is no longer any recognized entitlement to govern or to be governed. How do people feel about experts? We're in a good mood for this now in this country to discuss this. How do people feel about experts?
when we say people, which demographic are we talking about?
I didn't specify.
Yeah.
I was going to say that like people only trust experts that continue their point of view or back up their point of view.
Expertise is highly problematic. Expertise is highly problematic in a democracy because a truly emboldened democratic people, they'll think they're expert enough themselves, right? They don't defer to experts. Or they can grow mistrustful of experts, as we've seen in through the Trump phenomenon. Or a democratic populace can sit on their laurels, just sit back, kick back, put their feet up, let the experts run the show. And here's another political problem. The United States, in many ways, is a democracy, is a republic of experts. It's a republic of expertise. What I mean by that is the various agencies that the government has created throughout the decades to busy itself with different affairs, right? You have, for example, the USDA, which deals with agriculture. You have the FDA, which deals with federal drug administration, been in the news lately dealing with the pandemic and the various vaccines. USDA, I mean, yeah, that one's self-explanatory, I hope. And then you have the EPA, the Environmental Protection Association, agency, sorry. You get the picture. There's one of the first, and this has become an important case study in these agencies, was at the end of the 1800s. Is it the National Forestry Agency? Does that ring a bell with anybody? That was created under Teddy Roosevelt in the States to deal with the management of our forests, because there were some very devastating forest fires. Who else is interested in how our forests are run and managed? Think about it. What are you writing on? Or if you're not,
The paper industry.
right, if you're not typing, paper. Who started to weigh in and colonize the agency?
Like corporations or institute.
Georgia Pacific, right? Isn't that what they're called? What's the big paper company? I think it's one of them is called Georgia Pacific. Have we seen similar corporate colonization of these other agencies? Have corporations gotten their way with the USDA, the FDA, the EPA? The answer is yes, yes, yes. There's an inherent problem with setting up a republic of experts. Not only may people come to mistrust the experts come to be colonized by private interests, especially when the public isn't paying attention, right? Because the public will zone out, right? Oh, we have experts in charge of the EPA. No need to pay attention to that. And then look what happened with President Trump. He put in charge a man by the name of Scott Pruitt, who had been a lawyer for the oil industry and started dismantling protections, right? No one is insusceptible to corruption, right? So what Ranciere is saying is something kind of surprising, which is real democracy is when people rule who have no qualifications to rule. So the way I like to put it is, it's the Sarah Palin argument. Y'all know Sarah Palin, remember, governor of Alaska?
It was my governor, yes.
I mean, everybody laughed their asses off at her, but that's what Ranciere really has in mind. Like, who else has no, who should be president? My plumber. Why not? Why not?
So he would be a big fan of Trump then.
Yeah, he kind of would, actually. He kind of would. And why? Well, except that Trump had to he touted his own qualifications. You know, the point is, politics is when everybody feels emboldened and empowered to take part. If suddenly your plumber is president, you'd be like, what the hell? Holy shit. I should be Secretary of State, right? Everybody will rule, everybody will chime in, everybody will feel empowered to take part. And really, at the end of the day, this is what Ranciere is saying. Really, at the end of the day, really, the experts, how qualified are they? Really? Really? I have a secret for you all. This may not be such a big secret. When you grow up, when you unfold your wings and fly out like a butterfly into the adult world, and you have a profession and you get wrapped up in institutions, you will find out that people are fucking crazy. People are limited by their passions and their emotions and their agendas and their biases and their prejudices. The higher I've gone, and I haven't gotten that far, but the higher I've gone professionally, the worse it gets. So I think Ranciere is very wise to call to cast doubt on these experts for a variety of reasons. Okay. What's that? Yeah, basically. Yeah. Of course, that has been painfully exposed during COVID. All the passions of people. Let me pause there for a second and see. So I didn't quite finish the fourth thesis. Democracy is not a political regime. Here's the point. Democracy, when a regime is properly democratic, democracy is the foundation of political legitimacy. It legitimates a regime. Democracy legitimates a regime. This is counterintuitive. You have probably been raised to think that a regime is legitimate when the experts run it. Do you have a PhD? What's your PhD in? Very good, carry on. He's saying the opposite. He's saying people lose their buy-in. They lose their buy-in when they're in autopilot, when they kick back and the experts run the show. This can happen because of simple corruption. And again, like I have to stress the experience that we've had in America these last 5 years with Trump. You know, people are trying to figure out how the Trump phenomenon came about, but basically it came about because a good portion of Americans, white working class Americans, felt they were disenfranchised. They felt they were not represented. They felt that the government was corrupt. Trump did nothing to fix this, by the way. I'm just talking about their grievances. Their grievances were correct. Their solution was fucked up, but their grievances were largely, I mean, not directly. I mean, their complaint about immigrants is of course racist, but they were rightfully objecting to the abuses of globalization, Okay, Jay. I mean, now I'm sidetracked. But about the experts, you hear a lot of complaints from the Trump crowd about the liberal elites. And that was not terribly far-fetched, they felt that the engines of government were far removed from everyday reality. And they were. That's the problem with expertise. Sometimes we call the experts, we call them technocrats. They have technological fixes that they will rule over us, and they don't ask for our democratic input because technologists always know best. Have you noticed how the Silicon Valley crowd are? Have you noticed? They know best. Actually, I've read some very interesting political articles about the political attitudes in Silicon Valley. They are not fans of democracy. No, 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 no. Peter Thiel knows better than all of us. Okay. And so I think Jay points out correctly, I think, or was it Rosemary pointed out correctly? Like, I think he would say, and I actually wrote an article about this a few years ago in the Boston Globe, that, and I was quoting Ranciere, that the Trump phenomenon, you can hate it, and many liberal elites do, but it is an expression of democracy. It is a people speaking out, feeling that they are perfectly competent, and they feel emboldened. And those are features of democracy. Those are features of democracy. Okay. There is a guy by the name of Tocqueville. I'll make this comment and then turn it over to you all for some questions. A guy by the name of Tocqueville. He comes to America in the 1840s from France, and he writes a book called Democracy in America. I love this book. He basically visits various parts of the country and observes what's going on. He was a French aristocrat. He basically says, I'm going to go see what this democracy looks like, because the French democracy after the revolution had really stalled. He comes over to America, he visits some places, and he writes a couple points. He says, I can't believe on every corner, all the Americans do is talk about politics. It's so annoying. Plumbers, he's a French aristocrat. So he's like, can you imagine these plumbers and these farmers? I was amazed, right? You go to a town hall in New England, they're all raising their hand like they have an opinion, right? He wasn't quite so scornful. He was actually kind of impressed. And that's what American democracy used to be like. Now, I know what you're all thinking. Yes, it was white men. And those were some serious problems. But just in terms of a sense of enthusiasm, a sense of involvement, you had widespread involvement. Everyone felt empowered to join in, to speak up from all ranks of society all the time. Contrast that to today, right? When people don't take part in local politics, for example. That's what he's talking about. Tocqueville was talking about the local town hall meetings in New England, where everybody came out and he talks about how they were all making decisions about where the road should go, where the bridge would be, how high it would be. They all had an opinion. They were all taking part. When was the last time you contributed to a discussion about the sewer system in your city? Probably not, right? We don't even take part in town hall meetings anymore. This is a thing of the past. It's all been centralized and channeled through this representative government, as Jay pointed out. By the way, when Thomas Jefferson, before he died in the 1820s, he said, I think our republic is designed wrong. He said, people are going to rely too much on these representatives, these congressmen and senators, and they're not going to be bothered to have political opinions anymore. And he was right. Right? Very few people, or fewer people, I should say, maybe things improved, but fewer people have felt the need or the power or the ability or much interest at all in being political, right? So again, the point is that democracy is not about a regime for him. It's so much as it is the institution of politics itself. Politics itself, a legitimate regime that is respected and conveys authority must be democratic in some way. Because if it's not, authoritarian regimes, for example, they often don't last. There must be political buy-in. Authoritarian, another way of putting it this way is that authoritarian regimes, when they endure, they do have democratic buy-in from the people, some extent. And democratic buy-in is another word for a sense of parity, right? I have some kind of parity between you and me, the rule, who is occupying the position of ruling and me who's being ruled right at this moment. You understand me. You're not off on some mountain. You're not totally removed, okay? So it's all rather counterintuitive, but I think a lot of it is actually very sensible. And this, which leads to the next thesis, the sixth thesis. I'm going to skip the fifth one. The sixth thesis is that politics occurs as an always provisional accident within the history of forms of domination. In other words, politics is actually rare because a democracy very quickly ossifies. Like ossifies in English means like it hardens, it corrupts almost immediately, right? It is a very human and natural instinct to say, you know what? I don't really know much about geography or geology. I will let the PhD make those decisions. But then you don't pay attention anymore, right? And then you're screwed. So politics does not last long. He goes on to say, this is on page, where is the sixth thesis? This is on page 35 and 36. He says, there's a quote, the essential object of political dispute is the existence of politics itself. Politics is when people feel the need and they feel the power to speak up. And people constantly have to reclaim that power, constantly, always, all the time, because it is always being lost. It's always being threatened. Okay. Let me pause for a second there before I get into thesis 7. Anybody have any questions? Oh, okay. Well, thesis 7 brings up his distinction between politics and the police state. He says politics stands in opposition to police. What he means by police is the exercise of power, right? Things are decided. Policies are decided. Laws are decided. Those in power assume they are unquestioned, right? Follow the rules and move on. Police just keeps order. And this is where the aesthetic starts to rear its head. On page 36, he said, the essence of the police state is a distribution of the sensible, a distribution of the sensible. And here's a nice quote at the bottom of 36. He says, the essence of police lies in a partition of the sensible that is characterized by the absence of void and of supplement. Society here is made up of groups tied to specific modes of doing, to places in which these occupations are exercised, and to modes of being corresponding to these occupations in place. In this matching of functions, places, and ways of being, there is no place for any void. Everything is organized. It is this exclusion of what is not that constitutes the police principle at the core of statist practices. The essence of politics consists in disturbing this arrangement by supplementing it with a part of those without part, identifying with the whole of the community. Political dispute is that which brings politics into being by separating from the police, which causes it to disappear continually, either by purely and simply denying it, by claiming political logic as its own. Politics is an intervention in the visible and the sayable. Politics says this is what you may protest. This is when you may protest. This is how you may protest. That's what the police say. Politics says fuck it all and disturbs that. Right? It's an intervention of the people into the police state, which upends that. The key term in this quote, disturb. Politics is about disturbance. This is Ranciere's view. You don't have to agree. This is his argument. Politics is principally about disturbance, because when there is no disturbance, people go into autopilot and they don't pay attention and they kick back and they are ruled and they are abused. Okay. Right. Politics is an intervention in the visible and the sayable. The police, police organize society in terms of space and word, and politics intervenes in that. And so this is an aesthetic consideration, because it's an aesthetic interjection into spaces. I'm thinking of how Judith Butler, who's a contemporary feminist philosopher at Berkeley, she talks about, the aesthetics of demonstration, the aesthetics of protest, right? Ranciere would talk about the disturbance. The power of that, of protest, is disturbance. Or as we're going to see, dissensus. Moving into the eighth thesis, I'm going to read about this in the middle of the page. He has a quote. It consists, before all else, he's talking about police. Police consists, before all else, in recalling the obviousness of what there is, or rather what there's not. And the slogan is move along. There's nothing to see here. The police is that which says that here on this street, there's nothing to see and nothing to do but move along. It asserts that the space for circulating is nothing but the space of circulation. Politics consists in transforming this space of moving along, of circulation, to a space for the appearance of a subject, the people, the workers, the citizens. It consists in refiguring that space. That is in what is to be done, to be seen, and to be named in it. It is the instituting of a dispute over the distribution of the sensible. So in literal terms, like when I think of space of circulation, I think of like a busy commute, right? Cars rushing along the highway, people running to catch the bus on the street, people hurrying through the subway to get on a train, right? These spaces, the police state would like them to be, they don't disturb you. They don't get in the way, right? They keep you moving. Politics would transform this space, into a space where people, it would call your attention. It would disturb your space and call your attention to political affronts and political offenses that suddenly snap, turn you into a subject, into a citizen, right? Instead of just a commuter. Good. Any questions?
This was a question from before. do they say how long when they say like politics doesn't last long? How long is long? No, okay.
I don't think there's anything you can pin down, unfortunately. It's hard, you know?
I was like thinking like, are you saying like a century, one lifetime, one generation?
Well, instead of thinking of it in terms of a temporal limit, because then you'd have to be really scientific about when it began, right? Do we have 97% participation, 88%, 100? When are you going to, right? So I think his general point is that it's always precarious. That's a better way of thinking about it. Politics is always contending with its impending demise. It's always, and it's never a clear fight. Like, you know, it's always fighting. I might say, for example, you know, I was talking in terms of like how the electorate in America has really been declining over the last 50 years. So that we're, you know, in the last about 10 years ago, we were at about half the population voted. Well, I do believe things changed with Mr. Trump. This last election, a lot of people voted, which Ranciere might say, that looks to be some kind of victory for democracy. That is politics has come back, you know, in some way, in some degree. Let's see how long people feel alarmed or lulled to sleep, right? But it's better to just say that politics is always precarious. It's always politics is always trying to fight against the seeds of its own demise that are sown in it, right? The Democratic public would love to elevate an expert and just kick back, right? What Tocqueville says in the early 1840s is like, wow, these Americans, they really love this politics shit. They're crazy, but it won't last. And his reasoning, he said, the Americans are also really big into capitalism, and they're going to get more interested in making money. And he was right. He's like, people were like, fuck that shit. Let the senator run the show. I'm going to make money. I'm going to cash in. In other words, just a general way of thinking is that there's always temptations to not be political. There's always temptations, right? You know, what it means to be political is to be ruler and ruled. Who has time for ruling? Do you have time to go to your town hall meeting tonight and comment on the dimensions and plan for the sewer system? Could you give a shit, so to speak? Excuse me, no pun intended, right? Could you, right? There's a school in your neighborhood. Are you really going to go be like, blah, blah? No. We got work to do, and then there's Netflix, right? So you're always fighting this temptation. Right, which leads us to the census. And I believe, is this the 9th thesis? Page 38. I think this is the 8th. Oh, maybe it's still the 8th one. Yeah, this is a quote here in the middle of 38. The essence of politics is dissensus. And he means dissensus as the opposite from consensus. A lot of people think that democracy is about consensus. We all have to agree. He calls bullshit. Nope, that's not it. Politics is dissensus. That's when you break through the veneer, when you break through the veneer of an artificial agreement or an artificial consensus, and you shake up some shit. The essence of politics is dissensus. This is a quote. Dissensus is not a confrontation between interests or opinions. It is a demonstration of a gap in the sensible itself. Political demonstration makes visible that which had no reason to be seen. It places one world in another. For instance, the world where the factory is a public space in that where it is considered private. The world where workers speak and speak about the community in that where their voices are mere cries expressing pain. So, I don't know much about art, but I know a few things. This is Titus Kapfar. You guys heard him? Probably not pronouncing his name right. You guys know this artist? Titus Kapfar? Kafar? Anybody know how to pronounce it? There's his spelling right there. I can't have the chat. So you guys recognize what this is? Who's the white dude?
I don't know who it is exactly, but it looks like a kind of like a presidential portrait or something like that.
Closer. Yes. It's one particular president.
It looks like Jefferson, I want to say.
That is absolutely Thomas Jefferson.
Wasn't he the one who had like an African American mistress, and then when he died, he just like, oh, I'm not gonna free her.
Sally Hemings. That's right. Right. So Titus Kapfar has these beautiful paintings of like white men in their regal, iconic poses. And then the canvas is slightly pulled back and a black face comes out like, remember me? Right? I was there. I was raised when you were able to do that shit, right? And I'm still here. So I'm going to take a look at that, and I'm going to read this quote again on page 38. The essence of politics is dissensus. Dissensus is not a confrontation between interests or opinions. It is a demonstration of a gap in the sensible itself, a gap in the sensible. The earlier sensible was just Jefferson. There was a gap. The gap with Sally Hemings was not seen. Political demonstration makes visible that which had no reason to be seen. It places one world in another. For instance, the world where the factories of public space, in that where it is considered private, the world where workers speak about the community, and that where their voices are mere cries expressing pain. Okay. Any questions or comments? I think I'm going to skip the 9th thesis and get to the 10th one. The 10th one here, which is on page 42. Here he pits dissensus against consensus. Right. There is a tendency in democracy to think that democracy necessarily requires or demands a consensus, right? There must be an agreement. You hear it in the pleadings of the president. He's trying to pass an infrastructure bill now to improve roads and electrical lines and transit systems and like, and he says, this is something Republicans can get on board with, right? Or we should make a compromise, right? This is what Ranciere is pushing back against, right? Consensus, he says, this is on 42, consensus is the end of politics. Boom. Drop the bomb. Politics is done when you have consensus. Why? Because there's no more debate. It's bullshit in his view. Politics is all about debate. He doesn't say that so much here, but elsewhere he says that consensus is always fishy because it might be the elevation of a hegemonic view, which means to say that one party may have gotten its way, right? Also, consensus in the sense that it lulls us to sleep will also give rise to corruption. Another point, why is consensus the end of politics? Well, it points to, it presumes an ideal. We can rule out or ignore those who will not fit with or accede to consensus. Consensus is rather intolerant in a way. There's something a little intolerant about consensus. People who won't agree or won't agree, who are irrational, they're booted out. They're ignored. They're on the periphery. And he aligns this with the notion that there is a specific place for politics. Look what he says on page 43 at the very end of that top paragraph. He says, the return of politics boils down to the assertion that there is a specific place for politics. Isolated in this manner, this specific place can be nothing but the place of the state. So the theorists of the return of politics, in fact, announce its extinction. They identify with the practice of the state, the very principle of which consists in the suppression of politics. Statecraft, policy making. This is not politics. Real politics is when everybody takes part and feels the need to take part, and it is messy and ugly. It's exactly what Plato feared. All right. That's chapter 1, everybody. Anybody have any questions?
I guess I'm wondering like what, like if we were operating in like a pure democracy as he's putting it forth, like what would that look like in terms of like actually coming to a decision? Or like actually getting past like discussing or arguing or disputing to like actually, can you come to an agreement with over 300 million people? Like, is that possible?
For a time, but
or like just, like what that would look like. I don't know.
The real challenge, Rosemary, is to get everybody feel empowered and emboldened to continually contribute, right? You cannot let people be lulled to sleep or become apathetic, right? I always have these conversations in my political politics class with the undergraduates, and there's several undergraduates in this class. I mean, you guys know that, like, have you ever seen like, and by the way, this last election probably doesn't count because it was kind of exceptional, but have you seen like voter turnout for your generation compared to like the over 60 crowd?
Well, the over 60 crowd has more time and less college debt.
Who has more at stake?
The younger people.
Why?
We have to live with a lot of the consequences of what the older folks are like. We're gonna die soon, so we're just gonna do whatever we want, and we're just like, we can't. We have to live with your choices, but we also have to eat and house ourselves.
Oh, you have very excellent excuses, but still. Think about the kinds of things your generation cares about. Climate change, reproductive rights, maybe decriminalizing marijuana, criminal reform, right? Prison reform. How does the
legalizing marijuana and also releasing the people who were incarcerated because of marijuana?
How did the over 60 crowd feel about climate change, reproductive rights, prison reform? Take a guess. You all know.
They don't care.
They're not down with that shit. They're not down with that shit. And you are the ones holding the bag, right? Well, I mean, it's so when I talk about this with my students, I'm like, this is pretty shitty, everybody. And I don't mean to make you feel bad. I really don't. But, is there any mystery why Roe v. Wade is in trouble? Right? Is there any mystery why we can't get, background checks for guns? No, it's because your generation doesn't vote as much as the older people do, and they could give a shit. But then I asked the question, why is it that the younger generation is not voting? Does anybody want to expand on what Jay said? I am not hearing much from Kat today. Are you out there?
I'm here.
Nice. I'm not asking this question of you. I just want to bring everybody in. What would you all have to say? Like, why do you think your generation is less inclined to vote?
I think what you said earlier about people being apathetic, they feel like they're never going to make any change.
Good. Jay mentions you're very busy, which is good. That's true. I remember one of the arguments I used to hear people saying, like, politics is a turnoff. I put on CNN and they're always arguing. Yeah. I mean, these are all symptoms of the problem that, that Ranciere is talking about. We can complain about things, but I think people generally are content not to take part if they can help it, unfortunately.
Yeah, it just like takes like a lot of work. Like I find that, like, let's just say, like, pick like any topic that's in the newspaper, like the infrastructure bill. It's like, okay, I want to read more about like the history behind this and like what are all the different opinions that are happening. And it's like, whoa, that's like so much reading or listening, and like that's a lot of work just for that one topic to like try to keep up with.
Sure.
So it's like, I think it could get really overwhelming, like how to even like start, or like where to, like get your information or whatever, or source all your information. But I think also like there's this like, the sense of local politics is obviously really declined.
It has.
And like everyone's moving around, and like, like if you live in a big city, it's like, okay, like the local politics of New York City, like that's huge. And then, or, I don't know. It just, there's like these large scale politics, and then there's like really, really local politics. So it's just like so many different levels to try to participate in.
Good. Jay?
On a more like, I agree with the information, but also just the general getting to the locations. We don't live like in a village anymore. We can't just walk across. And the thing with the 60 above is the fact that most of them have stable jobs, a house, and a car. And a lot of the people in my generation either have faulty cars or they don't have cars and would rather just use public transportation and be more eco-friendly. But also that brings up to the issue of getting to locations that would then be held with like different political discussions and like voting and stuff like that. So it's not only that, it's also the fact that like the lack of time, I won't lie, more things are happening when we're at this stage because we're still trying to settle into our own jobs and careers, and that also leaves a lack of stability, which then it feels like politics, which is a long-term investment, feels less pressing than the short-term investment, which includes shelter, food, and all that sustenance, which some may argue that you have to be, alive and well to participate in politics, but that's.
Yeah. I mean, one way of putting it is that the system and the American economy has persuaded us to think that our private concerns are more important than the public, right? And what Tocqueville noted, what he noticed was that the early Americans in those New England towns, they identified the public and the private together They knew if they were running, if you were like a baker in Vermont, you had an interest in that bridge that could get your wares out of the town, right? Things like that. The importance of local politics is huge here. Have you guys, I know maybe we're not all in Baltimore, but have we all had experience with the Baltimore Sun? What do you have to say about the Baltimore Sun? You read Baltimore Sun? Anybody read the Baltimore Sun?
I mean, I've read it here and there, but I don't know enough to
Anybody
answer
have
your
any-
question.
Anybody have any general observations? How does it compare to the New York Times or the Washington Post? Anybody notice? We don't read papers now. We read like digital stuff, huh?
I heard something from my neighbor. Like we live in the same apartment, and he said, oh, he's like probably 70. And he said like the newspaper that you could only trust is the New York Times and others. So I don't know, because I don't really read like Baltimore Sun or some newspapers like this.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I found like I've never lived anywhere long enough to really like settle into like to really get invested in local politics. Like, I've never really lived anywhere longer than like 2 years. So it's like,
That's
it's just like you're constantly changing. But I found like I'm living in Annapolis right now, and during the pandemic, like I've had a lot more time, or before school started, I had a lot more time on my hands. So I would read the local, like they have a very, very local paper that I get delivered every day. And I love reading it. It's so interesting. And I do feel like I've learned a lot more about like what's going on in the town. And it's really entertaining and interesting.
Well, local politics is generally more empowering when you're plugged in, because these are things that are around you. You can actually see them, right? I have gotten hauled into local politics because my wife is involved in school construction where we live in Baltimore County. So I've gone to a couple of the Board of Education meetings with her. And you know what? They were kind of interesting, actually, and very educational. I wouldn't have gone otherwise. Why am I talking about the Baltimore Sun? Because there has been, in the last 15 or 20 years, political scientists in America have noted that people are generally more in tune with or interested and up to date on national news. They're more focused on the national than the local. That was made worse by Trump because he sucked all the oxygen out of the room, right? But even before that, people were generally more. So, Rosemary, you mentioned like the infrastructure bill. Like, now, ideally, that's not the kind of thing we would expect you to be well versed in, right? Real political power would be at the local level, right? You would be more in tune with the decision making going on around you in your community. The problem is people don't have interest in local politics and they don't take part. The moral of the story with the Baltimore Sun is it's a piece of shit. If you pick it up, you'll notice it's like 8 pieces of paper together. And this is something that's happening across the country. The local newspapers in many cities are going away, right? Like the New Orleans paper, I think, is like 3 days a week. They can't compete, right? This is the online news phenomenon. The paper in Detroit, I think they stopped home delivery. The only newspapers that seem to be doing okay are the New York Times and the Washington Post. Are the only two. Everybody else is suffering. But what this means is that many cities are losing out on local coverage and local interest, and people are not plugged into the politics around them. Now, the reason I'm pressing on this is because, again, with Jefferson, the idea is that your political investment is really based on the local, right? And once upon a time, citizens would have taken part in local politics, and that is not the case anymore. People do not take part in local decisions anymore. That's really fallen by the wayside. So how you would be empowered We're all in different places, but if we were at Micah living in Bolton Hill, well, you would go to the neighborhood association, you would get plugged in, you would make your voice known, you would speak out, cause some shit to happen, right? Dissensus, a la Mr. Ranciere, okay? But by and large, it's become too easy in this democracy to be apolitical. In fact, it's a burden to be political. How many of us would like to stop thinking about politics now that Trump is gone, right? I was so happy, but now you can't, right? I read Ranciere last night. I'm like, oh shit, gotta get back in there. Gotta be in it. Can't step away, y'all. Can't step away. Anyway, I'm babbling. Questions, comments?
This might just be a UK experience, but I also noticed, like, because I've lived like in the middle of nowhere in a village, but I also like for most of my life I grew up in London. Like I also noticed that I was like I knew more about the politics of the local village because people gossip, and there was like you were saying with like local newspapers. The village that my parents were living in had like a local like I say magazine. It was mostly just like made by like a group of like older ladies like in the village to talk about what was going on. But, like I knew more about that than I knew about like the suburb I was living in, London, for example.
And Jefferson would say that's great. That's so much better because I mean, national politics so often just becomes a soap opera that is entertaining, but you have no real say in it, right? So I think that's great. By the way, I mean, the interesting thing about Jefferson is that his prescription for reforming democracy, which he wrote in 1820, he was already quite old and the democracy was already 40 years old at that point, but his prescription was actually geographic. It was a geographic prescription. He wanted us to live in small towns in this country where we would take part in the local town councils. So urbanization, not that he saw it coming necessarily, but the urbanization and suburbanization of America would have been a major threat to democracy in his view. And in these local democracies, I don't care about your MFA or your PhD. You got the same voice as the baker and the carpenter and the car mechanic, Cletus, the car mechanic, got the same vote as you. There you go. Because if it's not, then you have an illegitimate system that people are not going to, who knows how long they'll put up with it. Right? All right, anybody else want to chime in? I'm gonna, yes.
Sorry. Is in China, even just in our city, like our local newspaper is like the main newspaper that our the citizen from our city will read. I don't know, but yeah, I read the newspapers from when I was a child and then when I grow up like this. So I don't know.
How big is the city?
Is the capital of the state in China, like the I don't know, like the capital city of the state.
So is it like 10 million people?
Yeah, kind of. I don't know how many people is in our city.
That's a pretty big city. That's much bigger than what Jefferson envisioned. Now, hey, listen, there are people who call Jefferson quite the idealist, and I don't entirely disagree. I think, and we know that he was an elitist, And we know that he was a slave owner who had a family with a slave and didn't really own up to her. He's not a great guy all around. I am just saying I'm sympathetic to some of his worries about our politics. But a city of 10 million people, that would not qualify as a locality for him.
Yeah, and most of them, I think, like in our generations, they only care about money, I think. Like they don't care about the politics.
Yeah.
The politics that they care is like what is posted new and will affect their stock, something like this.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I mean, in America, it's often economic issues that reliably get people to vote. You know, this hasn't been the case for 15 or 20 years, but when the price of oil was rising, people would go vote, right? They were mad. I hear President Biden is talking about raising taxes that might get people mad. Yeah, they call these pocketbook issues. All right, cool. Anybody else? All right, I'm going to talk about chapter 10 now. I'm going to skip ahead to chapter 10 called The Paradox of Political Art. And I'm going to talk about this chapter because here he gets into aesthetics proper. So hopefully you guys will feel on steadier ground here. He opens up here by talking about the mimetic paradigm, which the Enlightenment challenged. That art had a mimetic paradigm, that this mimetic paradigm was at the center of art, and what art should do. Anybody know what that means by this, what he means by this mimetic paradigm? I think the term mimesis has come up, I think.
I mean, it's like representative art, I guess.
Yeah.
Not sure exactly what the paradigm is, but.
Well, a paradigm is, what's a paradigm? Like a standard?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, yeah, I mean, or.
Let me
mean-
put the question in this way. What should, according to the mimetic paradigm, what should art do? What should the relationship between art and the audience be?
I think it might maybe it's supposed to kind of represent something, even if it's an abstract work of art, like it's supposed to kind of be a symbol or a metaphor or kind of allow the audience to connect it to something other than itself.
Well, actually, it's even more specific this time, because mimesis is not representation. Mimesis is imitation. So what does that tell us about the relation between the art and the audience?
I feel like it's supposed to be like a pattern of the audience just picking up on whatever the artist wants the piece to be about, not even necessarily what it truly means, but like that's what the paradigm is, I guess. Just that like cycle of you pick up something from this.
Yeah, and what is picked up is something very specifically moral. That was their idea. It's actually it's a very important, it's a Platonic idea. It's the idea that Plato was worried about art because he felt that it would inflame the passions. Plato was very upset, like with the ancient Greek myths. I think, did this come up? Did we talk about Zeus in this class? Zeus, King Daddy? King Daddy of the Greek Olympus. Plato goes off in the Republic. I mean, he is just fed up. He's like, Zeus, are you kidding me? You're making stories and statues about Zeus, and then you're sharing them with children. Anybody know why he was objecting? Anybody know what Zeus was up to?
Didn't he he had a bunch of children, and then I think he was like trying to marry them or something, or it wouldn't surprise me if that was the case. but I don't know exactly.
You're getting close. Who remembers their Greek myths? What was Zeus up to?
Cheating on Hera.
How?
Raping people.
Damn straight. Zeus was a rapist. Right? Do you guys know any stories of his raping?
Oh, that really weird one where like it was golden rain or the bull or the goose or I can keep going.
Well, those are the three. I can't think of any others. There's the golden showers. That sounds kinky, don't it?
Yikes.
I am not taking liberties here. I am just saying, I'm basically quoting from the Greek myth. He takes the form of a golden shower and he raindrops over a lady's private parts and he gets her pregnant. That is the weirdest one. The less weird one, but still weird, is when he takes the form of a bull and rapes a woman. Or there's Leto, there's the swan, right? Leto and the swan. There's the one where he becomes a swan and seduces a woman and impregnates her. So Plato's argument was, what's going on? Come on. Like, this is, he was worried about mimesis. He's like, what are you teaching children here? Besides the fact, if you ever read the Iliad, these Greek these Greek gods were a mess, right? They were jealous, they were fighting, they're vengeful, angry, envious. I mean, they're just terrible. So Plato's the one responsible for this mimetic paradigm, basically saying like, you better be careful what you portray and display because it will be imitated. He gives an example on page 135 of mimetic art. The plays of Molière. Molière was a French, what kind of playwright? He was generally a moralist. He was generally a moral playwright, but I think he might also be counted as a comic playwright. And he writes Tartuffe, which is his famous play, which teaches hypocrisy. So it's mimetic in the sense that you learn the perils of hypocrisy. You see hypocrite in action. The one I had to read in high school was L'Avare. L'Avare. Well, avare in French is greed. So L'Avare it's a play of someone about someone. It's like Scrooge. It was a play about someone who was hopelessly greedy, and again, the message being like, here, in other words, is what not to be, right? So playing on the mimetic paradigm. And he points out that, this mimetic paradigm comes under attack during the Enlightenment, principally by Rousseau. Anybody tell us what was Rousseau's critique? Why was he critical of the mimetic paradigm?
Was he the one who was like, humans should not try to understand the ways of God?
I don't know. That's not this exact point here, though. I think how did Rousseau push back on the idea that people would imitate what they see?
Was logic? I don't know.
What? What'd you say, Jay? I didn't understand that.
You know what? Never mind. It's fine.
Anybody else? Around page 136, Ranciere tells us that Rousseau is critical of this presumption of a direct relation running from the performance on stage to its effects on the minds of the spectator. Essentially, the question of what that effect is undecidable or unclear. Rousseau didn't think that, who knows how what you see on the stage is interpreted, and it's impossible to predict that will have a clear and obvious impact on the people watching it.
I guess that's like today's argument about video games
Yes.
causing violence.
It's so funny you say that. I was just thinking that in my head. Right. I wrote a book on guns, so I had to deal with this quite a bit, right? People saying that, like, these shooters, they have been raised on and trained on Call of Duty, right? And Micah students always get very upset about this, especially the ones in video game design, because they don't want to hear that shit. And I mean, there's very good reason to suspect that it's wrong. Psychologists have pointed out it's wrong, actually. Anybody want to speculate why? Any video game?
It can be seen as like an outlet of those emotions, so they're going on the video game rather than real life. This isn't for me personally, but like a lot of like people have suggested that.
I like that argument, Blythe, actually.
There's actually studies done by psychologists who basically sorry, that's outside. Who basically said that playing violent video games will have an increase in impulsivity within the short term, within like 30 minutes, an hour, but afterwards they usually have a decrease in arousal or stress responses.
Interesting.
So what Blythe says is right. It actually helps decrease a lot of that. It acts as an outlet.
I think the issue becomes because gaming has become a job in the way of like social media and content creator, it's when it leaves the video game and then you see it on Twitter or Twitch or Reddit, etc. I feel like that's where I could argue that, like, I don't say violence, but like just a lot of hate talk, and not a lot of cancel culture, a lot of hiding behind like the anonymous like wall that you can create. I feel like some video games definitely like push that, and communities surrounding those video games push that, including like big content creators, for example.
Yeah. My when I wrote the book about guns, I started it with the Sandy Hook shooting, which in Connecticut, remember, in 21st graders were shot by this guy, Adam, I forget his last name. And the head of the NRA came out and he said, among other things, said, it's the movies they're watching. And he listed movies that were like 20 years old. It was really weird. And then it's the video games, and the gun people are always playing the video games. And the retort that I offered, among others, was with other people was, maybe it's just the guns, we have a shitload of guns. They're all playing violent video games in Europe. They don't have shootings. We have guns all over the place. Yeah, anyway. Anybody else want to weigh in? Any video game defenders out there? This is your time. This is your moment.
I was just gonna say that I agree with Blythe that I feel like it only can become dangerous when you kind of like turn it into like a whole like different environment in your head that you belong in. And I listen to like a lot of crime podcasts, which like probably isn't good for me, but I was listening to one the other day about this kid who He wasn't a kid, but he lived at home and he was like 30 years old and all he did was play video games all day. And then he started watching like a cam girl and got super obsessed with her and was like lying to her and like stealing his family's money and stuff like that to like spend on her. And then he murdered his entire family because they were trying to like help him with his like addiction to her. So I guess like that's just like a case of like taking it too far and like living in that like online environment can be dangerous, I guess.
Yeah. Having real relationships with real people will cure you pretty quickly of the fictitious world. I have two comments. Kat, I'm worried. I'm very worried for you being engrossed in those podcasts.
Hey, now I will argue I'm also in the same boat, but apparently people enjoy that because A, we have anxiety, and B, it's an adrenaline rush watching, at least listening and like actually hearing people going through that. Like it's a trauma, it's a flight or fight response. But yeah, that is a shot of adrenaline.
Okay. And then I have one question. What is a cam girl?
It's basically like an online stripper kind of.
Oh,
So
I-
like it's like you can just go on and like choose a different girl to like watch and you can pay, like give them tokens and stuff. I learned a lot about this from that specific episode. So but yeah.
Guess I had that coming. I should have seen that one. I walked right into that.
The parallels with like the story you told, Kat, from the podcast and what I was saying is also like I guess that's an extreme of how content creation and like having a relationship with someone you don't know via the internet. I feel like for if we like tie it back around to gaming, like something like Twitch, where a lot of people believe that they are friends with the streamers they watch, even though not necessarily like they don't actually have any real connection. And if that streamer is also perpetuating hate through the language that they use via the video game, like younger children and younger adults are more like to like mimic that because they want to be like their cool streamer friend that they watch, I guess. Yeah.
God, Twitch. I just saw a headline about that today. So weird you're talking about that. I didn't know what it was. So it's like YouTube? Is that what this is? It's another kind of YouTube?
Yeah, except for it's live stream. So you're live watching someone play video games or have a podcast, and the people can interact in like the live chat and donate money to the streamer and subscribe to their like channel for
It's
money.
a little more like it perpetuates a little more than YouTube, the whole sense of friendship, because it is both real time and you are having a conversation with the person who is streaming.
Interesting. I'll have to check it out. I have to say, I have a confession to make, everybody. When I walk in and see my kids watching someone else play video games, I want to punch my children in the face. So I'm like, what are you doing with your life? Play the video game or go outside, but watch someone else. Oh my God.
Herman, some of them are like $60 per pop. Come on.
What are?
The
Video
video
games.
games. It's like an accessibility thing. A lot of
It
people will
is.
watch video games that they can't afford to play.
My kids are
Yeah.
like giggling along to the comments. I think they're listening. They like the commentary. I just don't get it. I don't get this world.
It's okay, Furman. You don't have to.
I don't worry. I don't punch my children ever. Let me move on. We have a few more minutes. I want to get to the end of this chapter because I think it gets to some pretty important conclusions. Back to Rousseau. So Rousseau is critical of this mimetic paradigm. He tells in 137, it says, another reason Rousseau is critical of it is because this paradigm presumes a separation between doing and seeing. And he doesn't really see that. He doesn't get that. He's very suspicious of that. Rousseau, by contrast, favors an ethical immediacy. On page 137, there's a quote. He wanted to overturn the logic of the theater by making the spectator active. Right. So, in a traditional play of Moliere, you have the actor on the stage, putting on a show and the audience removed. And Rousseau is skeptical about the influence traveling across that remove. And he wants to change the theater, for example, to make the spectator active. And in general, and Ranciere says this means turning the art exhibition into a place of political activism. There's a quote, art has to leave the art world to be effective. In this discussion now, Ranciere again posits the efficacy, the power of dissensus. Here, this is how he puts on page 139 in the middle. Right, an aesthetic rupture. I like that, top of that paragraph 139. But a few lines down, he says, dissensus is a conflict between a sensory presentation and a way of making sense of it, or between several sensory regimes and or bodies. This is the way in which dissensus can be said to reside at the heart of politics. Since at bottom, the latter, that is politics, consists in an activity that redraws the frame within which common objects are determined. Politics redraws the frame. Politics is an aesthetic act in his view. It doesn't involve aesthetics, it is aesthetic. It is aesthetics. It involves redrawing the frame within which common objects are determined. And then about 10 lines down, he says, politics invents new forms of collective enunciation. It reframes the given by inventing new ways of making sense of the sensible, new configurations between the visible and the invisible, and between the audible and the inaudible, new distributions of space and time, in short, new bodily capacities. And then he goes on to the next page to give us an example of fiction. Fiction will do this. On page 141 at the bottom of that big paragraph in the middle, he says, it involves the reframing of the real. He's talking about fiction here. So fiction involves the reframing of the real or the framing of a dissensus. Fiction is a way of changing existing modes of sensory presentations and forms of enunciation, of varying frames, scales, and rhythms, and of building new relationships between reality and appearance, the individual and the collective. This intertwining frames a new fabric of common experience, a new scenery of the visible, and a new dramaturgy of the intelligible. It creates new modes of individuality, a new connection between those modes, new forms of perception of the given, and new plots of temporality. Fiction has the power to expand our community in a way. It asserts who are subjects. It asserts who the subjects are, right? Who are citizens, who are fellow human beings, who are members of our community. Societies, as we've seen throughout history, are, like European American society, find it too easy to block out or ignore, peoples, potential members of community. And it's the role of art in its various media to interrupt that perceived consensus and say, hey, like in the case of America, there were Black people here, right? And there were Native Americans here, and you built this fucking country on those things, right? And their heritage is here, and this is where their heritage is that you ignore or don't notice, right? He says about the aesthetics of politics, he says it consists in the framing of a we. This is on page 142. a we, which is expanded to include the anonymous, right? They were anonymous. So that Titus Kopfar painting, right? Sally Hemings was anonymous. He's pulling back the canvas to show, that her story is now part of it too. Okay. May I have any questions? And this is where, I'm not going to get into details, but you think about examples of where fiction does this, how fiction does this. And I don't know, maybe you could think of movies. You could, if you haven't read any good fiction lately, maybe think of some movies. You could think of some visual art pieces that do this too. I'm going to give some examples in a minute. Why he zeroes in on fiction, I'm not exactly sure. I don't remember why fiction. Probably because, the written word, it's easier to give a fuller picture of a subjectivity, right? You can give a backstory, you can provide nuances, So like, if I show you this picture again here of Sally Hemings, and I'm not even sure that's Sally Hemings, right? But there is an African slave behind Thomas Jefferson. What do we know about this person? I think in a way, Ranciere is suggesting that visual art is a little bit impaired in this regard. Fiction is superior because it can build a story around this person and flesh out that subjectivity. And make that subjectivity three-dimensional.
Like you also like it takes so long. Well, yeah, you read a fiction book over a longer period of time than you would maybe look at a painting. Like I know when I finish a fiction book, like I kind of like still like float in the world of that book for a while after I finish it, and kind of still like think about the characters and think about the story, and and it kind of like maps into like my life a little bit. So like you really kind of like settle into it in a way that visual art, it's like, you look at something really briefly and then you move on most of the time.
Good. Good. I don't read much fiction, so I'm not a great expert on this. I don't like fiction. I admire what he's saying here. I give it mad respect, but personally, I have a hard time getting into it myself. I have a whole list of books, a pile of books on my bed here. I'm trying to work my way through. It's just like, oh, it's like pulling teeth. I'm flexing on you, am I? I don't know about that. I'm quite the opposite. I'm telling you my shortcomings, my failings. Let's move on here. This was a really funny quote on 144. He talks about, I read this as like a swipe at Warhol. And this is an example of when art is not sufficiently critical, and it doesn't sufficiently create dissensus. He talks about, he's thinking there's a lot of art out there, he says, that is devoted to the critique of consumer culture, right? So I'm thinking of Warhol immediately. And this is what he says about it. And this is the middle of 144. He says, today, indeed, much art continues to assert not only its will, but also its ability to denounce the reign of the commodity, its iconic ideals and putrid excrement. Oof. Calls for the need to struggle against this side of spectacle, to develop practice of détournement continue to come from all corners. And they do so by invoking the same standard repertoire of denunciatory techniques. Parodies of promotional films, reprocessed disco sounds. I don't know what he's talking about. Advertising icons or media stars modeled in wax figures. Maybe some of you guys know the pieces he's talking about. Disney animals turn into polymorphous perverts. That is an exhibition I really think I don't want to see. Montages, although I think I have seen it, montages of vernacular photographs depicting standardized petty bourgeois living rooms. Overloaded supermarket trolleys. There, now we're sounding like Warhol. Standardized entertainment and the excrement of consumer civilization. Huge installations of pipes and machines that depict the bowels of social machine. As it swallows, everything turns into shit. Okay. These sorts of rhetorical dispositif still prevail in a good many galleries and museums professing to be revealing the power of the commodity, the reign of the spectacle, or the pornography of power. But since it is very difficult to find anybody who is actually ignorant of such things, the mechanism ends up spinning around itself and playing on the very undecidability of its effect. In the end, the dispositif feeds off the very equivalence between parody as critique and the parody of critique. He's not impressed. And at first I thought this was a dig at Warhol, and he may be. The only problem is we know that Warhol is slippery, and Warhol would have disavowed that there was any critique of consumer culture at all. In fact, I was telling you, like, in certain documentaries, he says things like, I love cornflakes. He likes the brand. Basically what Ranciere seems to be saying here is like, all these artists think they're being cool shit with these very critical, these very creative critiques of consumer culture popping up in a variety of ways. But you know what they're doing? They're really just affirming the commodity.
Yeah, I think actually Warhol, at the time that he made his work, that was like dissensus, because it was kind of this radical shift in like the linear art narrative. But I think
was it meant to be a political dissensus? Right.
Well, again, that's a thing where like whether or not Warhol's intention was that was what the audience took it to be. But I think maybe what Ranciere is saying is like today, like in the 21st century contemporary art world, like the critique of commodity isn't like this new topic that perhaps was like initially brought up in the 60s, whether or not it was like specifically Warhol, but like pop art and things like that.
Yeah, he's very dubious of the power of parody, of the critical power of parody, right? He doesn't seem to think that the critical power of parody does nearly enough. It misses its mark, or it has an undesired effect on people, right? Like some people just stepping away from Warhol's intentions for a second, keep them out of mind. Some people look at the Campbell soup cans and think like, oh my God, this is so pathetic, right? We are dominated by an aesthetic of consumerism and commodities. It's miserable. It's automated. And some people were like, cool, I want to put that on my wall, and like didn't faze them at all, So, I mean, actually Warhol kind of might even be perfect, because he's, the key term here that Rousseau points out is this undecidability. The real problem with the mimetic paradigm is that it's undecidable, what effect you're going to have on your audience, right? Are you going to make them critics of consumerism or fans of it? So I think what he's trying to say is that this parody still, when it's, parody of this kind of art, still hangs on the mimetic paradigm, which will miss its mark. But more importantly, I want to call your attention to the page across, where he talks about, what he thinks is a more superior, which is the proper political function of art when it creates dissensus. That middle paragraph on 145, in a first step, then a shift takes place as strategies of critical clash are replaced by those of testimony, archive and documentation, processes seeking to give us a new perception of the traces of our history and the signs of our community. Let us illustrate this shift from critical art to testimony art with an example. In a work of the 1970s, Chris Burden made a sort of counter monument called the Other Vietnam Monument, dedicated to all the anonymous Vietnamese victims of the American War. The monument includes copper plaques on which Burden engraved the names of other anonyms, that is, Vietnamese names picked randomly from a phone directory. And I have that piece here for you all to look at. Here, this is it. And have you guys seen the Vietnam Memorial in Washington? In case anybody hasn't, I'm going to show that here. This is the Vietnam Memorial, for those of you who haven't seen it. There. I believe that's it. Wait a minute. That might not be it. I just realized. Shoot, this is it. I'll go with this. There you go. That's the Vietnam Memorial in America. And if you haven't seen it, it's the names of all of the soldiers who died in the Vietnam War. Their names are engraved, every single one of them, alphabetically. And it's a very long granite wall, stretches a good distance. And what this artist did is, you know, to create dissensus by saying, oops, you know, look, there were other people killed. Actually, estimates are that something like the Vietnamese suffered millions of casualties. The United States had about 50,000, but the Vietnamese suffered millions of casualties. And so it's a, you know, it's a kind of a rupture. Think about his earlier quote about dissensus. It's a rupture. There's a perceived gap that this artist is inserting into, expanding the notion of community, of who else is worth thinking of who else we should think of, okay, and who else we should consider. He goes on, for those of you who are interested, in page 148, he expands his critique of parody versus dissensus. And he tells us that the trying to find where I want to pick up. There's a nice quote here at the bottom of 148. He says, "The real always is a matter of construction, a matter of fiction." That's beautiful. The real is a matter of fiction. You know, we create the real. The artist creates the real, the author. The real is a matter of construction, a matter of fiction, in the sense that I tried to find above. What characterizes the mainstream fiction of the police order is that it passes itself off as the real, that it feigns to draw a clear-cut line between what belongs to self-evidence of the real and belongs to the field of appearances, reputations, opinions, and utopias. A police order would say, these are citizens, and that's it. The arrests are anonymous, ignores them. Consensus, he says, top 149, means precisely that the sensory is given as univocal. Political and artistic fictions introduce dissensus by hollowing out the real and multiplying it in a polemical way. The practice of fiction undoes and then re-articulates connections between signs and images, images and times, and signs and spaces, framing a given sense of reality, a given common sense. It's a practice that invents new trajectories between what can be seen, what can be said, and what can be done. Good. Anybody have any want to chime in on that? So I think this is a really, this is a very fruitful and promising chapter here. If anybody wants to for a research paper later in class, if you want to explore it and weigh his arguments further, especially in terms of concrete examples. So I was thinking of a couple to give. I gave you Titus Capvar. Here's another one from Titus Capvar. It's George Washington on his horse, kind of an iconic pose, right? Those are nails in his mouth. I believe that's the shredded Declaration of Independence. I didn't have time to read up on it before class, so I don't really know what everything means. But that looks like dissensus to me. I was really thinking more about Kehinde Wiley. You guys know Kehinde Wiley? He's pretty awesome. This is one collection of them. And what he does so well is, I would say this is dissensus in another way, right? He takes these very familiar, African-American figures, contemporaries, but he puts them in these classical poses, right? Almost religious poses, right? Look at that. It's like, I can't think of which one, but there is something by, I'm thinking of an Albrecht Dürer painting of, Jesus in that pose. Actually, I think this is Dürer with I can't remember. It's all a blur. That one, I don't know. You guys could probably look this up. Art historians would tell us something. That one is clearly that looks like a Ecce Homo, here's the man. That's when Pontius Pilate reveals Jesus to be executed. The only one that I sort of can get is, see if you all can tell me if I'm right. Is this a play off of a Caravaggio? I was thinking of that because of the perspective and the light. No, everybody doesn't want to talk about art history. I get it. So there you have it. Anybody want to offer up some other examples of dissensus? Art as dissensus? And again, just to put this in the terms that Ranciere does, right? This is an interruption into a white space, into a white Christian European space, right? These figures, which are a foundation of European culture, they're being reclaimed. There's an opening. Again, just use his language. That's the link from the Kehinde Wiley pieces if you're interested. Anybody have any questions or comments? All right. Well, that's pretty much it for today, guys. I'm going to stop there, okay? But I can stick around if anybody needs to chat. And then for next week, of course, you have Susan Sontag. So that's exciting. I love Susan Sontag. So be sure you get that book, okay? And you will find Susan Sontag a breeze, trust me. She does not mince words, unlike this clown. She gets right to it. All right. All right. Have a great week, everybody. Okay. See you later.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.